All right, good afternoon. I'm Chris Leak, Chair of the City County Planning Board. I now call to order our virtual work session for July 22nd, 2021. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. King, please, to call the roll.
All right, George Bryan.
Here.
Melinda Dunnigan.
Here.
Walter Farabee.
Here.
Jason Grubbs. I don't believe Jason's with us today. Clarence Lamb.
Here.
Chris Leak.
Here.
Mo McCray.
He's still connecting to audio.
Mo is here. I see her, so we'll count her as present. There she is. Brenda Smith.
Here.
Jack Steelman.
Here.
All right.
I'm here too. Sorry, it took me a little bit to get on sound.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you, Mo.
All right, Mr. King, I'll just turn it over to you so we can go through our agenda, starting with item 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've got a couple of presentations today for the Planning Board, and our first will come from Courtney Driver, who's the Director of our City County Utilities Department. And just to kind of give you a little background, we had a zoning case or two recently where there were sort of some questions about sewer availability and possible sewer expansions in the future. And I think the question was asked, what is the Utilities Commission doing with respect to sewer in the future? And so we wanted to invite Courtney to spend some time with the Planning Board to share a little bit about what the Utility Commission is working on and any information she has relevant to sewer expansions in the future. So with that, I will turn it over to Courtney.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the Planning Board. Thanks so much for letting me join your meeting today. I have a short presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yes, so Aaron has mentioned to me that there's been some questions about our sewer system, the boundaries and capacity, and so I'll briefly talk about that. But before I dive into that, I did want to just talk a little bit about our department, just who we are and some of our different divisions. So I feel just some of you may know this already, but some of you may not. So I'll just cover this real quickly. But I'll go through who we are and our different divisions, and then I'll get into some discussion about sewer system capacity and expansion. So first, our department is very similar to the Planning and Development Services Department. We are a city county department. We are city employees that report up to the city manager, but we are governed by a utility commission that's appointed by both the Winston-Salem City Council and then the county commissioners. Then the mayor and the chairman of the county commissioners jointly appoint the chairman of the utility commission. It's an 11-member board, but we're broken down into 6 divisions. We have administration, water treatment, wastewater treatment, solid waste, utilities field operations, and our meter services. And I heard you guys talking about a picture. I'm in the same boat as Aaron is. I need to update ours. We've got 2 members in this picture that are no longer on the commission, but we do need to take an updated shot. We've got Mr. Ruffin, who's no longer on it, and then Mr. Stewart, and we currently have 1 vacant county position. But I do believe we have 2 members, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Younger, that served previously on the planning board. So they bring a lot of valuable insight from serving on that board before. But as I mentioned, we are governed by a joint agency, which is the Utility Commission, and it was formed in 1976 between a merger of the city and the county water and sewer systems. And then in the 90s, oversight of the solid waste disposal services was added to the responsibility. So that's solid waste disposal, not collection. So it's the landfill. The collection services are under a separate department. And we are an enterprise fund, which means we are not funded by local taxes. Our department is not part of the general fund. We operate off of our revenues from our water and sewer bills that everyone receives that lives in this community, and then the tipping fees that you would pay at a landfill. And it is required that all solid waste and water and sewer entities be set up this way as enterprise funds. That is the state statute. So I want to take you real quickly through what I call the water cycle. I guess you all know about the water cycle that you learned in school. This is a different water cycle, but very similar. It is a cycle. So first part of the cycle, we pull water out of the Yadkin River and Salem Lake to treat. And actually, one thing that the council back in the 50s, 1950s, thought about was they participated, the City of Winston-Salem City Council participated in the funding of the Kerrscott Reservoir in Wilkesboro. So between us and Wilkes County, we own the top 30 feet of that reservoir. And what that means for us is that if we have any kind of drought condition here, we can call the Army Corps of Engineers and ask them to release water down the Yadkin River to our intake. So that was some really important forethought of people, you know, from a group of our leaders years ago that really benefit us today. But we have 3 water treatment plants that have a combined treatment capacity of 91 million gallons a day, and we average around 36.1 million gallons a day. So we're using around 40% of our water capacity. So we have plenty of water for any kind of development or new businesses or water users that would come to this area. This is a picture of our Pascal Swan water treatment plant. It is located in Postown. It's a 25 million gallon a day conventional treatment plant. It receives raw water from the Yadkin River, and it began operations in 2004. This is the Nelson Water Treatment Plant. It's our largest plant and the oldest plant. It's a 48 million gallon a day treatment plant. It receives water from the Yadkin River. It began operation in 1964. There was another addition. When it was originally constructed, it was a 24 million gallon a day plant. In the 80s, it was expanded to 48. We are getting ready to undertake a major renovation to this plant. We just received bids and it came in at 108 million. So there's a lot of concrete that needs to be repaired, processes, you know, aging equipment, aging infrastructure. So that's getting ready to happen out there. And this one is located in Clemens. And then we have the Richard Thomas Water Treatment Plant. It is our newest plant and the smallest. It was the oldest plant before we completely demolished it in 2010 and rebuilt it. But it is, you know, located near downtown. It receives water from Yadkin River and Salem Lake. So it's the only plant that has dual source of water supply. And then it began operation in 2011. So after we treat the water for drinking purposes, we consider it clean water. We have field operations and our meter services. So our field operation groups, they maintain the water distribution system, which is around 2,300 miles of water pipe. Then our meter services division, they read around 130,000 connections. We also have a cross-connection control program that oversees any kind of cross-connection or contamination that would come back into the public water supply. We have a wastewater collection system. After we use the water for drinking, cooking, showering, whatever, after it gets used, it's considered dirty water at that point, or wastewater, sewer water, and it goes through another series of pipe where it's about 1,800 miles of that pipe that our crews have to maintain. And as you can imagine, we have construction services. We deal with a lot of pipe, pipe failures. The picture on this slide is on Waltown Street, where we had a pipe failure that created a pretty large sinkhole, and our crews have to respond to that. They also respond to any sanitary sewer overflow, and so they stay fairly busy. One thing I did want to mention, we are a 24/7 operation. Our plants are operated 24/7. That means in the middle of the night, someone's there. Christmas Day, someone's there. We have someone at those facilities all the time. And then, of course, our field operations group, they work normal hours, but we always have people on call, so they could get called at any time. We have a first shift and second shift. And then once it goes through the wastewater system, it makes it to one of two of our wastewater treatment plants. This is a picture of the Archie Elledge wastewater treatment plant. It's located off Griffith Road in Winston-Salem. It's been in operation since 1956. It's a 30 million gallon a day treatment capacity plant, and it discharges our treated water back into Salem Creek. And then the second wastewater treatment plant that we have is in Clemens. It's called the Muddy Creek Wastewater Treatment Plant. It's been operating since 1986. It's got a treatment capacity of 21 million gallons a day, and it discharges the treated water into the Yadkin River. So that's what I mean by the water cycle. What is our water cycle? We pull water out of the river, we treat it, it gets used, we send it to a different treatment plant, we treat it, and then we put it back into the water supply. Then we also have the solid waste division, which we operate the Haynes Mill Road landfill, which is the largest municipally or publicly owned and operated landfill in North Carolina. So there's other landfills that are larger, but this one is the only one that's publicly owned and operated. We also have our construction and demolition disposal landfill, which is on Old Salisbury Road, and we operate 2 yard waste facilities, one on Overdale and one on 452 Parkway. We also partner with the county on drop-off recycling collection, and we administer the household hazard waste and electronic waste collection, also known as 3RC, on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. So any questions about that before I jump into our sewer kind of discussion? Okay. So this is a map of Forsyth County, and it shows the growth management areas, and it also shows in the blue line the boundaries of our water system. And as you can see, our water system, you know, extends further out than sewer, because there's challenges with sewer in the topography. And the green line shows our boundaries of our sewer system. So you can see there's areas in Louisville and up at Blues Creek that are harder to serve, just because of the way the topography and the drainage goes. So the way water and sewer extensions are extended, there's kind of 4 different ways that this happens. We have a developer extension. So a developer comes in and says, I want to build a subdivision, or I want to build a commercial site, and they're going to extend water or sewer out to the site to meet the needs of their project. Once that happens, they convey that infrastructure to the city for us to own and maintain. So that's one way, and probably that's how most of our extensions happen. We have assessment projects, which we don't have as many of those as we did in the past, but that's when a neighborhood comes together and they petition for service, water or sewer. And if there's over 50% of property owners that are interested in, my lights just went off, sorry, motion lights. If there's more than 50% signers that are interested in service, then the project is considered sufficient, and we can assess the property owners along the extension route based on their frontage foot. So that's another way that water sewer can be extended. And then, of course, we have our capital projects. Most of our capital projects are just to maintain our existing infrastructure, but there are times that service can get extended through a capital project. And then we have intergovernmental partnerships. So, for example, we worked with Forsyth County recently on building a new pump station out in the Clemens area near Tanglewood to serve a future business park. So the county, acted as the developer. The utility commission funded a portion of that project because we went through an analysis, and there was benefits to the utility for that lift station. So there was that partnership. our responsibility as far as our water and or sewer system is to manage the growth of the existing system. So both within the pipes and at the treatment facility. So we do this by master plans. We have master plans for water, treatment and distribution, and then on the wastewater side, treatment and collection. Just this week, we advertised for consulting services to help us with our wastewater collection system master plan, which we're getting ready to start. We do these master plans on a 5-year cycle. So what the collection system master plan will look at, they'll look at capacity in the pipe, it'll look at future growth patterns, it'll look at previous growth patterns, it'll decide if we have enough capacity in the pipe, or if we need to, take an 18-inch sewer outfall and make it a 36 or whatever size that needs to be, depending on what growth we think that we'll see within the next, time period. And then it'll also look at the treatment plants to make sure that we have sufficient capacity at the treatment plants as well. I've had a lot of discussions with Aaron about, there's pockets in different areas where we could, or there's potential or interest in economic development that aren't necessarily served by sewer currently. But that's one thing that we're going to look at in our master plan to say, okay, well, if these areas develop, what could the potential flow be, wastewater flow, and can our downstream system, our existing system, handle that? And if it can't, what projects do we need to incorporate in our capital plan to make sure that we are ready for that if it happens? So I know that's a lot of me talking, and I didn't know if there was any questions that anybody has as far as that.
What do, this is Clarence, what do lift stations cost? And I know there's no such thing as a typical, but what's a typical if you plan a capital expenditure?
Yeah, so it really depends on the size. So we actually have 50 lift stations within our system. And we have some that are much larger and some that are just serve a little small neighborhood. But I can tell you the one that we built in Tanglewood, or right behind Tanglewood, with the county, all in all, it was a $5 million project. Now, granted, that was going to serve the business park itself, which I can't remember the acreage of that business park off the top of my head. But it also it's also accepting flow from Davie County, because we have a partnership with some other counties to treat their wastewater as well. So that one is one of our larger lift stations.
Mm-hmm. I know you about 10 years ago, probably you installed one south Kernersville in the Caleb's Creek area. And that, I think, was going to serve about 4,000 or 5,000 rooftops. What would something like that cost?
Oh man, you're gonna, I would have to, there is a rule of thumb, and I don't know it off the top of my head, where you can say, okay, well, this is, the dollar amount that it would take per gallon, that, the size of the station. I don't know that off the top of my head. I definitely can get those numbers, but I don't know that off the top of my head.
Yeah, I just wondered if, if we looked at extending sewer into some of the higher growth area, some of the GMA 5s, or not 5s, but 4s and things like that. I was just trying to get some kind of rule of thumb, per 1,000 houses or per 500 houses or something like that. But you don't have that right at hand, I guess. It's
yeah, and it really depends on. Yeah, I can definitely pull something like that together. It really depends on the use. So you could have a huge water. It could be not based off houses. We usually estimate about 240 gallons per day for an average size house. That's kind of the number that we use. So if you had a subdivision that was going to have 100 homes in it, you can easily calculate the flow. What's a little bit harder is these industrial parks or business parks where you don't quite know the usage yet, could be a restaurant, could be a large water user, could be, you know, and depending on what goes in that space, really can have a big impact on how much flow, water-wise and wastewater. So it really depends on the use of that space. But I can get you just an average, you know, cost per gallon, and then you could break it down and say, okay, well, we know that 240 gallons can serve one home, and you can kind of do the math that way.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I would also add that from what I'm seeing in the commercial real estate industry in Forsyth County, a majority of the industrial, as it's called, development that's taking place is more so oriented today, and I think for the foreseeable future, to warehousing and distribution than it is to older traditional water using manufacturing. And I'm sure the consultants that you've got, Courtney, or rather, I would imagine they see that same trend going
Yeah.
forward.
That's absolutely correct. And, you know, obviously part of the process will include conversations with Aaron and his staff about what they see or hear about what's coming, and they can help us plan accordingly.
One last question. Sorry.
Go ahead, Clarence.
Just one last question. So when we're talking about land use, increased densities per given chunk of land makes no difference. It doesn't increase efficiencies for the utilities department because it's all based on 240 gallons per household, right?
Well, so I guess when you say increased,
increased density is like 10 houses per acre instead of 2 or 1 house per acre really doesn't make any difference in terms of what it's going to cost to install utilities.
Well, so I would say yes, we look at it differently. So I guess, you know, if you have a real dense area we'll just say it's an apartment complex, you just run a water line in, and it can be a shorter length of pipe that can serve however many units are in that building. And then obviously we have one meter that reads that entire, you know, have a master meter that reads that unit, versus several houses out in a rural area that could take much longer pipe, you know, more for us to maintain.
Clarence, I'll jump in with Courtney.
So-
I'll jump in with Courtney on this. I think there's two pieces of that. Increasing the density, I think, does impact the amount of gallons treated within the basin, right? If we've got, you know, 100 acres and now it's RS 40, and you could do 100 lots, and we increase the density to RS 20, and now you can do 200 lots times 240. We're going to have more wastewater to treat coming into the basin. For an individual subdivision, I think, going back to your question, you know, if you've got to build, if your subdivision's got one road going in and it's, you know, 200 linear feet, it doesn't, whether you got, you know, 50 lots or 100 lots, the cost to install the street and the pipes is the same, right? So
Right.
It's just however many meters coming off of that. So I think there's sort of two buckets there. There's, you know, the density in terms of the number of homes for the construction cost is probably not that much, but what Courtney's team on the back end faces is that overall cost to treat whatever's coming out of that basin probably does go
Volume
up.
of water. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I know Mo was going, I think Mo and then Brenda, I know Mo was trying to chime in there a couple times.
Yeah, no worries. I have another quick question. I'm going to put my developer hat on. Do you ever enter into agreements where the developer owns and maintains the lift station?
No. So if the developer was going to maintain it or make it private, then they would do it on their own, and we wouldn't be involved with that. So we wouldn't ever, I guess, have an agreement to we wouldn't be a player at the table, I guess.
No, but wouldn't that be another effective way to stand out, right? So if they were to create an easement to the pipe, they maintain the lift, they constructed, maintained, and owned the lift station, wouldn't that also effectively extend the sewer system?
Yeah, so it would be considered, if the developer kept it and made it private, it would be private infrastructure. So it wouldn't be considered in our system. And, you know, there could be a situation where it's the pipes themselves. I can't think of one off the top of my head that was like this, but I guess, you know, you could have the piping that's public, and then there's the private lift station. But we would have an agreement with the developer where they conveyed the piping component to us.
Sure.
But the
That would be
lift
through
station
an
would be there.
easement, but I didn't know if, you know, outside of getting an FP3 structure, that you could have an independently owned one that was later convened over, if you would accept that. as an option.
Okay, so we have had developers approach us in the past that have a private system, or I don't know if it may not be a developer, it may be a homeowners association, it may be, you know, whatever, that have approached us that says, okay, we have this private system, we would like to turn it over to the city to own and maintain. And we have taken on ownership of existing systems, but we make sure they're in compliance with our standards before we take them over. So sometimes that's easy, and sometimes that's cost prohibitive for the for whatever entity it is that's looking to turn it over. That's why a lot of times, if there's a development where, you know, they think they want to build it a certain way and they're going to keep it as private now, but if they think that there's ever a chance that they would want to, you know, turn it over to the city for ownership and maintenance, it's better to go ahead and build it to our standards. That way they've paid that, you know, that cost up front, and there's nothing they have to redo in the future.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is Brenda, had a quick question about the capacity that we have. How much do we have excess capacity in the system for treatment?
Yeah, so I failed to we have excess capacity. I mentioned this on the water side, but on the sewer side, I did fail to mention that. So right now, we have 51 million gallons of permitted capacity to treat at our wastewater treatment plants, and we're averaging around 33. So we're about at 65% of our treatment capacity on the sewer side. But you know, that's part of the master planning process. Depending on the rate of growth that we think what we've seen since the last master plan and what we think we'll see in the future, we'll have, guess, you know, like a roadmap or some guidelines of when we think we need to do our next expansion project at the treatment facilities.
You mentioned you have permitted capacity. That may be something not everybody on the board's familiar with, that you actually have a permit with the state?
Yes, we do. We have a permit with I'm sorry, go ahead.
Would you explain that just a little bit?
Yes, so we do have a permit with the state, and we have to adhere to that. So if we go over that, or if we see that, or if we're getting within, you know, any kind of thresholds, the state will step in. For example, the way the rules are written, once we get into 80% of our permitted capacity, we have to be under design or have a study of how we're going to increase capacity. You know, we have to be working towards a project. Once we hit 90% capacity, we have to have a project under construction that would increase capacity at the plant. So we're constantly monitoring that.
All right, thank you.
I have a question here.
Hey, Walter.
Hey, Courtney. Hey, sorry, I had a little tech flub when you were presenting, but so I missed a little bit. But in the master plan process, I know you all would look, or your consultant will look at your areas where you've already seen the most growth. Would it also be somewhat, I'm gonna use the term exploratory, for new areas for growth in that in the process for the master plan?
Yeah, we would look at it all. We would look at, potential areas that aren't served. We're definitely going to look at potential areas that, even areas now, because we're repurposing areas. You see a lot of that where, this area may have been lower density and now we're adding higher density. So we've got to, adjust for that as well. So we'll look at anything, that could ultimately impact the capacity.
Okay, it's good, because I was thinking in response to something Mr. Stillman had mentioned about the warehouses and distribution. Of course, we've seen a lot of that, especially in COVID. Everybody's ordering stuff. But I know for like our side, Greater Winston, Winston-Salem Inc., we have seen a good bit of projects come through the state for, I guess, what you like to even higher industrial use. The only thing has been that traditionally we have not had the land to do so. I know we're currently in conversations with planning and other entities just trying to identify some areas for future industrial growth. So I know you all will do great work anyway, but just want to put that out there that we do have the opportunity for some more intensive industrial use if the land has been identified.
And,
Well, I'll
and
add. Go ahead. Sorry.
after you, Courtney, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, that's why we try to keep our planning on a 5-year cycle, because, there was a time when we saw a lot of heavy, we had larger water users that had, larger volume. And we were seeing, our water use go up tremendously. And that's really dropped off. People are conserving more. There's more energy or water efficient fixtures that people are using. And so we really saw a decline in our water production. But, things are starting to come back up, and we want to plan for that.
Awesome. Good.
If I could ask one 5 miles high up question, Courtney, it would be to say that I have thoroughly loved working in this environment, in this community for 30, close to 40 years now. And for 30 to 40 years now, I have heard the entire time what we just heard from Mr. Farabee, and that is we're always short of sites. And as often as not, one of the barriers to overcome that is the availability of sewer. What is your master planning doing today that it didn't do 20, 40 years ago to actually impact the ability to create more supply? I will say I was with the manufacturing client today on whose behalf I had done some homework beforehand. In Forsyth County today, we are probably shorter on existing buildings and existing land than I've ever seen it. And I just don't know what's being done to turn that around.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the utility commission.
Not a complaint, but it's a really sincere question. Same old results. Same old thing, same old way of doing things, get the same old results. What's our new thinking?
Yeah, so I would say, typically in the past, the utility commission has not been in a position where they wanted to act as a developer. We own and maintain a system, water and sewer system. So we have let others develop, and then we take it over and own it and maintain it. We know that some of these sites, like you said, or some of the available sites, we'll say that, have sewer challenges with sewer. And a lot of times getting sewer to those areas can be cost prohibitive to make it work. And so that's one of the conversations that Aaron and I are talking about. How do we, we had that partnership with Forsyth County to open up that area with the larger lift station out in the Clemens area. And
Right.
I think it's going to take some more of that kind of partnership with different entities, whether it's, you know, City of Winston-Salem or Kernersville, different I guess different partnerships to kind of make sure we extend or we can work together to serve those other areas.
Is the availability of economic development funding that's made to you a difference maker?
When you say economic development funding, what do you mean by that?
It was my understanding from several years ago that there was a separate fund for economic development projects. I think within your budget.
So there is an economic development fund, but it is controlled by the county commissioners and the city council.
Right.
So they would be the ones that have to approve those funds.
Understood that completely. The question is there enough there to enable you to be more proactive, or is it being managed on an as needed basis?
I think it's more managed on an as needed basis. So I think, you know, if a developer comes in and they request, they're working, most of them they're working with the city manager's office, and I don't know if it's who it is at the county, but both the boards have to approve that, and so they would just work through the economic development channels to get that approved by those boards. The commission does have a small, I guess it's an economic development fund, but it's there's $3 million in it, and it was set up in the 80s. It's hardly ever been used.
Yeah.
It's not a grant, it's a loan, so it has to be paid back. But the commission can set the terms of that, and, you know, however they want, see fit per the, you know, depending on the project. But there's certain stipulations to it, like it has to be for a project that would create so many jobs.
Yeah.
So it's for economic development. But the commission sets the policies. So that was a policy that was established, you know, I think back in the 80s. And then there's also the economic development fund that part of the funds from the utility go into a reserve that's controlled by the county commissioners and the city council. So I think it is, we're at a point where we do need to get creative and think about where we're at now, and, you know, is there new policies? Do we need to refresh things? Because some of these were established, you know, years ago, and they just might need to be revamped or relooked at.
Thank you for thinking that way. I would highly encourage it. And I believe it's the case nationally that more and more companies are inclined to move to pad-ready sites than otherwise, and we can stand to be significantly more competitive. We're just going to take proactive steps and the expenditure of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Courtney, this is George Ryan. We have run across, I guess, some limitations, particularly in the eastern part of the county. And we've had talk about Union Cross Road being a ridge or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Talk just a little bit about what the limitations are to development when it gets over to that area. And what's the interplay when you begin to deal with another municipality wastewater or water system, like over in High Point or something like that?
Yeah, so that one is an area that definitely is on my radar, and so I think it's Wahlberg Road is a ridge line, and so anything that's to the east of that would have to be pumped over, and that's one thing that we're looking at. We know that that's an area that there is interest in developing, and, you know, does it make sense to you know, to think holistically and try to size a larger lift station out that, you know, a larger public owned lift station, part of our system that would serve that area versus several little private systems, you know. So those are conversations that we definitely are having. The problem would be just finding the funds to build the lift station. Once you pump it back over Wahlberg Road, you know, it would pump back into our system. And of course, we are managing, you know, making sure we have enough capacity to handle it downstream. But that would be, and that is an area that part of our master planning process we'll look at, and we'll say, okay, can our downstream system handle the projected flows if that area develops, if there is a lift station put there to serve that area.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, dear. That was great conversation, and I really appreciate you letting me join you today.
You got time for just 2 more questions or not? All right, we've got, this is Clarence in Kernersville. Obviously you're aware, we got a little business park over here where Amazon Fulfillment Center is, FedEx Ground, and some other stuff. And of course, High Point ran sewer to that site. Why would we have done that? Why would we? I know it has to be a dollars thing, but.
So why would we have let High Point serve that site instead of? Right. Okay. So basically, it has to do with drainage basins, and High Point is in that lower southeastern corner of the county, and that drainage just falls that way. Just kind of like the Blues Creek area, that drainage basin falls in a different direction outside of our Yadkin PD drainage basin.
Yep. And then lastly, I think you mentioned one of your refurbishment projects, renovation projects, is going to run, was it 180 million or something like that?
Yes, the Nelson is 108 million.
108 million. Okay. How much money do you have?
You're not supposed to ask people how much money they make or how much money.
I know. I was like,
you know that.
You'll have to ask Lisa Saunders, our chief financial officer. She keeps a better handle of that. But we do have, you know, over $100 million budget that we manage, and that includes our debt service payments, our operations costs, and I can tell you, we are very fortunate that we talked about density. We're very fortunate that we are dense enough that we can generate the revenue that we need to maintain our systems properly. You know, we have clean water. We have, you know, we meet all of our regulations. There's a lot of other smaller systems, like in rural areas, that really struggle to generate enough revenue to maintain their systems. And that's why a lot of times we partner with some of these smaller systems, such as Davie or Yadkin County. You know, they struggle, and the drainage basins don't always line up with county or city boundaries as well. So we have very competitive rates. We are, you know, when we look at our peers, Greensboro, Durham, Raleigh, Charlotte, you know, we're second to the lowest. It's a little over $100 bi-monthly for our average customers for what they pay for water and sewer. I think, you know, Greensboro's right at 100, so we're right there together. Raleigh and High Point, they're at 150, you know, bi-monthly for their average water and sewer. So, you know, we try our best to make sure that our rates are competitive and that we generate enough revenue that we can sustain and that we don't have any kind of issues here, but that we also keep them where they're affordable. So,
thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to say a big thank you to Courtney for spending some time with us this afternoon. This was, I think, really helpful, and I think it's kind of a preview as we begin to start thinking about that next comprehensive plan, which we'll be talking to you about probably at your next work session. A little preview into that. this is going to be a big theme of what we're going to be dealing with as we talk about kind of big buckets or big things we're going to be looking at. I mean, this is it. Jack alluded to it. He is right. And we've been in several meetings with Walter and the team over at Greater Winston-Salem Inc. as we start thinking about sites available for economic development. And they're just not out there. And so to Jack's point, we've got to kind of start thinking about different ways. Are there areas where it makes sense to take sewer outside of the basin in an effort to try to create some additional spots for economic development? Is it repurposing existing sites? What do those opportunities look like? But that is going to be a big theme of what our upcoming plan will look like. And it's certainly something we're going to collaborate closely with city county utilities on. I'll mention just two things real quick before we move on to item 2. Courtney mentioned the Kerskot Lake. And I don't know that a lot of folks in this community really know about that decision that was made, but I'd venture a guess that there was probably not a wiser future planning decision made in the state of North Carolina than that one. As we sit here in 2021 and we know now what we know about the importance of clean drinking water, something that we frankly took for granted for a number of decades, and then we saw what happened in Flint, Michigan with the problems there. Courtney can tell you what's going on down in the eastern part of the state as you try to treat PFAS and some of these other Gen X chemicals that are just in that Cape Fear River basin that are just nightmares that we're fortunate to not really have, knock on wood here, that we were fortunate to not have. And then, I'm sure a lot of you have seen what's going on out west, at Lake Mead and where those water levels are. A lot of those challenges they're having out on the West Coast with water supply. We kind of take that for granted here, and to know that we have that much water capacity in the bank is a really good sense of security for these citizens and for Side County for now and for future generations. So, like I say, that doesn't get enough attention for what it is and for how well positioned we are, hopefully, for the future on that. And the last thing I'll say kind of goes back to a little bit of what Jack was asking about is, do you have enough money in terms of economic development and thinking about some of those things? I think all of you are probably aware that local governments receive money from the federal government in the American Rescue Plan. And there are several different call outs in that federal guidance of what you can use some of that money for. And one of those is water and sewer. And so Courtney and I and some others have kind of had some discussions about, is this something that needs to be considered for the city and the county? They've both got their individual pots of money. And so those are some conversations that Courtney and I have been working with Kyle Haney and the folks here on the city side as well, and Mark Owens at Greater Winston-Salem Inc. to think about, are there some opportunities now that we do have a potential source of funding that can maybe thaw out something that may not have otherwise happened? And so as we continue to get into the later summer and early fall, I think those discussions amongst our elected officials will continue moving forward. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that's at least discussed. And we'll see where that one goes. But just know that staff is aware of that, and that is a consideration that we've been keeping an eye on.
I'd just like to say, I think it's okay for our generation to be as proactive as were the people back in the 40s. So let's do it.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Courtney. Again, much appreciated.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chairman, if you're ready for item 2 on your agenda, we will move on to that one. And that is going to be a presentation by Keith Huff, who is our stormwater director for the city of Winston-Salem. I believe Keith is with us. There he is. And so we have, much like we have had some recent discussions around sewer availability, we've also, it seems like this pops up every so often where we have some more defined discussions around stormwater rules, trends, things of that nature. So we typically invite Keith in to spend some time with the board every couple of years, and we were kind of due for that, so it lined up well. So Keith has got a presentation he's going to share with the board. He's going to hit some of the basics around our stormwater rules here at the city for about half the presentation, and then kind of transition into some trends and some things maybe that touch on what you've been seeing in zoning cases here in recent times. So much like Courtney, I'm very pleased and thankful to have Keith spend some time with us this afternoon. So Keith, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. Good evening now, I guess, Mr. Chairman, members of the planning board. Good to see you guys again. Some faces I have seen for many years and could probably teach this presentation. Other faces, good to meet you. But Aaron reached out to me several weeks ago, said the board had some questions about the stormwater management post-construction program, where it's going, kind of where it came from, and what we're seeing right now. So I put together a brief presentation, and it concludes with some observations. But if at any point in time you have any questions, feel free to stop me, and we'll entertain those questions. So can everybody see a slide titled Stormwater Management Requirements?
Yes.
Good deal.
Yes.
Good deal. So basically, what I'd like to go over is kind of the rationale for the stormwater ordinance. And when I say stormwater ordinance right now, I'm specifically talking about our post-construction development control ordinance. Go over some of the quality and quantity requirements that it requires for developers that are under those thresholds. Then shift to some climate trends, what we're seeing right now regarding storm events and how it relates to those stormwater thresholds that we're requiring the development community to adhere to with this ordinance. And then show the board some just general site observations, what we're seeing that'll possibly spur some discussion. So with that said, the beginning. Stormwater management in North Carolina, and specifically in Winston-Salem, started in the mid-late 90s. And basically, it was predicated by an unfunded federal mandate, where the federal government said, medium and large municipalities, you folks have to manage stormwater runoff from your urban areas, but we can't give you any money to do it, but you need to do these federal requirements. So in comes an unfunded federal mandate. And similar to what Courtney was talking about with the wastewater aspect, we are an enterprise program. We collect about $10.2 million every year to undertake these NPDES, or National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. All the state loves their acronyms. To undertake these rules and regulations, just like the wastewater folks have an NPDES permit to discharge wastewater into the surface waters of the state of North Carolina. Same with stormwater. So feds come in, unfunded federal mandate, then a supplementary session law in 2006 adds rules that require water quality elements. So the federal government is more interested in the quality of runoff from our community, where locally we might have more focus on the flooding and erosion. Also, the city had an audit of our stormwater management program. And that's where the federal government comes in and they say, okay, city, you're doing this aspect good, but we think you can do these aspects better. So that heightened our awareness and our fine tuning of our programs. Then finally, we have a federal element called total maximum daily loads, and those are in place on Salem Lake and High Rock Lake. And that's basically how much pollution a water body can assimilate with still meeting its intended usage. And the state and the federal government has determined that Salem Creek and High Rock Lake are exceeding those pollutant thresholds. So the city, as a major urban center, they focus on us on what we're doing to reduce those pollutant loads coming to Salem Creek and ultimately High Rock Lake. So narrowing down to the local factors. When this first started a decade plus ago, we had very antiquated policies for stormwater runoff. Our review process, it had no operation and maintenance agreements. There were no escrow accounts. We could not compel a property owner to upkeep and maintain their stormwater device after it was constructed. In addition, we didn't manage for multiple storm events. We managed for 1 year, one 10-year pre-post event. And if it exceeded it, it bypassed it. If it was less than, it ran through unabated. So we were very single faceted in that approach. And as we went through from the 2008 timeframe, council started seeing more localized flooding and erosion citywide. It wasn't concentrated to the floodplain areas or riparian corridors. This was upland areas that were not riverine in nature. So it got more on their radar and became a priority for our elected officials. So going into the post-construction ordinance, it has several thresholds to it. And again, when we talk about quality, we're talking about how clean the water is coming off the site. And this lends back to the state and federal requirements. When we shift to quantity, that's how much water is coming off the site, i.e. your flooding and erosion. So for Chapter 75 or the post-construction ordinance, we'll talk about the quality provisions first. So if you have a development that disturbs more than 1 acre or is less than 1 acre, but part of a larger common plan of development, which will ultimately exceed 1 acre, then it's subject to the quality provisions. So that acre of disturbance, whether in whole or in part, tips you into quality. And within the quality provisions, there's a high density and a low density, with 24% being the threshold. Anything 24% or less is low density. Anything 24 or greater, high density, and then you're going to have to implement a stormwater control. And I'll break those down in a second. And then our quantity provision has 1 threshold. If you have 20,000 square feet of new impervious area, then you're subject to it. So that's how the quality and quantity provisions break down. So focusing on the low density projects under the quality side of things, pretty simple. If you meet these thresholds, then you'll try to transport your stormwater runoff by vegetated conveyances to the maximum extent that you can. And then you're going to place buffers on your intermittent and perennial surface waters within the development site. So on the table below, you can see kind of the threshold, 0 to 10 acres. You'll have a 30-foot buffer, half of which is undisturbed. And then it goes all the way up to greater than 50 acres. You would have a 100-foot buffer, 50 feet of which is undisturbed. So the low density sites are the most simple, least complex, no stormwater control, but you're trying to preserve those internal features like your conveyances and your buffers. So when we shift and we tip that 24% built upon area threshold, then we're going to have to implement a stormwater control. And this control here is geared toward quality of runoff. The state of North Carolina and NC State has focused on the first 1 inch of rainfall. That's your quote unquote water quality storm. So this is what we would require the developer to manage for in a standard quality high density site. So they would control and treat the stormwater runoff for the first 1 inch of rainfall. And basically their drawdown time shall be 2 to 5 days. You can't release all that water at one time. It's got to be gradually exported from the site. And the discharge rate should be less or equal to the pre-development discharge rate for the 1 year 24-hour storm. Again, that's reinforcing the fact that we want this water to come slowly off the site so it's not hitting the next downstream property owner.
Keith, let me jump in there because I think there's one point here that's really important to kind of point out that you and I have discussed several times. You know, there's often times where we will get a development that's coming in and maybe it's in an urban area and their neighborhood surrounding it, and they trip the threshold where they got to manage their stormwater. And so you've got let's say you got a stormwater pond, the pond collects the water's got to discharge somewhere, and everything around it is developed with lots. And so the pipe inevitably is going to be pointing at somebody's backyard.
Absolutely.
And so the conversation that the reason for those rules is you're kind of picking your poison. You know, if you let it release all rapidly, then you get an intense amount of water going on to the neighbor. What we have in our rules is kind of the bathtub model that you said, where it kind of drips out over 2 to 5 days. And I think what you shared with me is, what you guys do is you get calls from neighbors saying, the storm's been over for 4 or 5 days and my backyard's still soggy and wet. So that is something I just want to kind of point that out to the board, where it's kind of, stormwater staff is in a tough spot on some of those because there's no perfect solution out there. And we're kind of having to pick the lesser of two evils right there. There's just not a regulatory great solution out there. So I just wanted to kind of hit that while we were on that slide, Keith.
Yeah, you're spot on, Aaron. You're holding water in a bathtub in essence, and you control the release rate of that bathtub full of water. A big outlet nozzle, it's coming out very quickly. Smaller outlet nozzle, it's going to leak out slower. But that presents issues for the downstream property owner in any case. Too quick, flooding and erosion. Too little, standing water, mosquitoes, vectors. So yeah, you're spot on. It's a catch-22 when developments abut each other and there's no relief point for the release of that water. So absolutely right. So with high density, obviously the buffer rules apply the same as low density. So shifting to quantity management, this is where the bathtub gets bigger. This is where we're holding a lot more water. For quantity, the developer is going to hold the 2-year, the 10-year, and 25-year storm events much bigger than that 1-year first-inch rainfall storm. And again, they're going to store that volume and they're going to release it at that 2 to 5 day drawdown period. So again, the bathtub is much bigger with these storms versus the quality provisions. Your developer is going to have to dedicate much more land and maintain, whoever that is, be it an HOA or a commercial establishment, a much larger device at that point. But again, we're trying to control the discharge of that bathtub full of water and release it in a non-erosive manner over a period of time. We also want to have the developer look at the receiving channels and water bodies. And this also presents a catch-22 because if the runoff from the site is going to be deemed to have a negative effect, then all we can do is require management. So we're back to the bathtub, the bioretention cell, the stormwater wet pond, or the stormwater dry pond. So that leaves us in a catch-22 as well when we have developments directly abutting each other. And I'll show some pictures in the presentation future about when they abut each other and what we see. And finally, design of water impounding structures or dams. It has to conform with the North Carolina dam safety standards. So that before I go to climate, is there any question on the stormwater controls, the bathtub, so to speak, that we're creating with these developments to hold this water back and release it at a slower rate?
Keith, this is George Bryan. The rule is that when the water's released, it can't be higher than the level prior to, right?
Basically, for rate, it can't exceed the pre-development runoff rate. So if you had a 10-acre green space site and the pre-development runoff rate was 10 cubic feet per second, it could not exceed that post-developed.
Okay, but the problem the abutting places are having is that the water is concentrated in its runoff to a spout or a pipe that concentrates, it puts more water there. It isn't distributed over maybe 300 or 400 yards at a little bit at a time. So can't there be some control on that? Because that isn't the same way it was before the development was built.
Yeah, absolutely. So George, the development community and the post-construction rules that the state came out with initially allowed something called a level spreader at the end of the pipe. But to do that, you need to have a significant swath of land, and it has to be level and it has to be long and linear depending on the amount of discharge. And what they found out is there's not enough available land that the developer controls to release that water in a sheet flow fashion. So what it ends up doing is concentrating, finding the nearest draw or swale, and then reconfining to that concentrated element. So that's the dilemma that you find in these urbanized situations where.
And other urban areas haven't come up with other solutions on this?
No, sir, I have not seen that silver bullet, so to speak, to skim that.
Okay.
So climate trends. Everybody sees the weather. Everybody sees what we have undergone in the last 4 or 5 years, where in recent years, the rainfall events in our community have been much shorter in duration, but much higher in intensity. We don't get those long 2-day soaking rainfalls. When the rainfalls come to this community, they're hitting us very quickly, and they're dumping inches of rainfall in a matter of minutes and or hours. And this is the type of storm event that overwhelms our drainage conveyances. It overwhelms our stream channels. They're enlarging and deepening in response to these storms. And it goes back to what we said at the onset, where there's stream erosion citywide, and you can have a development that has pre-existing conditions, and then you have another development upgrading it from it, and there's not too much you can do because there's no relief point, George, to your question, to still the water out, to settle it, to diffuse it. And when these storms come through, you know, there will be effects. Right here, top right, you see the silt fence from a development site that is flooded the next downstream property. And they are currently under development. And then this is a bridge or infrastructure that overtops regularly. So these storm events, we thought they were freak storms, but they're showing to be consistent year in, year out. And to reiterate, we manage the 2-year, the 10-year, and 25-year storm. Is this enough management capacity when these storms seemingly come every year?
Keith, I'll just mention real quick, because you're on this trend right here, and your presentation is pretty timely, and this is more of a worldwide level. But if you saw some of those storms that hit Germany and Austria the past week, and the flooding there, and literally just last night when I was watching the nightly news, the storms that hit China, Keith, they used a term I had never heard before, which was a 1,000-year storm. You know, we always work in, 500 years, a 500-year storm. I'd never heard 1,000-year storm. But if you saw in that footage, the rain came down so quickly, and they got about a year's worth of rain in a short period of time. It flooded the subway and trapped people in the subway cars while they were on the subway. And so I just say that to say, you know, these things are happening worldwide. These things are getting more intense. It's stuff that, you know, we really hadn't even contemplated before.
Absolutely. And that's where historically we used to associate it with named weather like Hugo, Floyd, stuff like that. But those storms weren't in association with a named weather system, unfortunately for them, which I appreciate that segue. So what is the 1,000-year storm? What is the 1-year storm? What you got in front of you here, this is a NOAA curve that shows basically on the right side, the one is a 1-year storm, and this is correlated. The horizontal axis is the day or duration. Vertical axis is the precipitation depth in inches. And the 1-year storm, it's all probability based. The 1-year storm has 100% probability based on this historic data that we're looking at of occurring at our latitude and longitude any given year. The 10-year storm has a 10-year probability of occurring each given year. The 100-year storm has a 1% probability. You see the math where we're going. But as of late, the weather events have not played nice, so to speak, with the history, where we're seeing 25, 50-year storms every year, multiple storms. And for example, the 25-year storm, as far as the 6-hour duration, that's just picking a duration that we utilize because that's the typical size of our watersheds. Basically, you're talking about less than 5 inches of rainfall. But if you look at the weather and pay attention to the weather, those things are occurring on a regular basis. The 50-year storm at the 6-hour duration is just about 5 inches of rainfall. And we are seeing this more frequently. And then, like Aaron was mentioning, you have that 1,000-year storm that is for the 6-hour duration. Let me move to that versus the 12. You're talking about 7.5 inches of rainfall in basically 6 hours. Incredible. But the point being, those storm events are shifting to the higher side. So question on the table, are we collecting enough rainfall and runoff in these stormwater control devices to accommodate what Mother Nature's throwing at us?
Can I ask you a question about that, Keith?
Yes, ma'am.
So just to put that in perspective, how many years are these stormwater devices designed to last?
That is a function of the storm events and then the maintenance that is completed on the device. They are best the day that they are installed and deemed functional. But if you have an entity that stays on top of it, they clean the device, they maintain the device as appropriate, they can last decades before needing to be totally retrofitted. Opposite of that, if you have an entity that doesn't maintain the device, the forebays clog up, pre-screening devices are choked out, then it will bypass flows almost immediately. So it is to answer your question, it is a function of maintenance, but best case, a couple of decades.
So the issue though is in a couple of decades, if the trends continue, what we're designing for now may be outdated.
Correct. And
during the lifetime of that device.
That's right. And that's where the open O&M agreements, the operation and maintenance agreements that we require developers to adhere to now in perpetuity have a certain design element. It does not account for the shift in storms, obviously, with additional capacity or forebay size or whatnot, but it does hold them accountable for maintaining the device as installed, but doesn't account for future issues.
So if we were going to deal with this increased intensity of rainfall, would you suggest that at some point we consider either going to a higher rainfall event as a standard, or using some kind of projected values for what to design a stormwater management pond to? In other words, not use historical data, but use more realistic data of what we expect to see.
I think it could be a combination of both. The more direct thing is to design for a higher intensity event. Gather more of that water under that curve that we just saw. That would help the situation. But the main factor, I think the overriding factor, is the maintenance of it. When you have homeowners associations that are struggling, funding is an issue, and they are getting these storms that come through their neighborhood pond regularly, the maintenance is a huge concern as well.
So Keith, I have a question. So I think sometimes we get hung up in our meetings, especially with the new development, worrying about the flow of the storm water and how that's going to affect the new neighborhood or the neighborhood that it may run off through. Can you kind of give us guidance on how to kind of deal with this? Because I would think when you all are planning this out, you're thinking through all of this. Is that correct, or am I wrong?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, here's the issue, and these slides will speak a lot to your question, is we know it's coming, but with Chapter 75 of the city code, we can only implement the ordinance. We can only require them to do the stormwater management controls. And that's where, do you require developers that are coming to the table now to make more of a downstream investment to mitigate the already existing issues? That's a tough sell for a new developer. So again, it's a difficult situation. And I actually say this in the presentation, these stormwater devices, they don't mimic the green space conditions as that land was when it was undeveloped. They do the best they can to hold the line, but they don't turn back to where it was green space. They do the best they can. And this is the best technology that we, Charlotte, everybody in the state and the Southeast is using, but knowing it doesn't mimic the pre-development conditions as far as hydraulics and hydrology, unfortunately. So
Thank you.
it's a tough situation. So in general, some site observations, and probably everybody on this board has seen this and knows this, but we are developing sites today that are obviously more challenging that we ran away from 20 years ago. You can see to the upper left-hand corner or upper right-hand corner, this is a very steep topography. It's draining into a draw of another subdivision, their backyard, so to speak. And, you know, these steep topography sites, existing utilities, other constraints, it just makes the site more difficult to develop and maintain as far as stormwater management. And like we talked about, some of these sites go directly into another subdivision's backyard. Lower right-hand corner, you got a fairly sizable stormwater facility that's going into two property owners' backyard. And they will live with that. They will have to bear the repercussions of the maintenance of that facility as long as they live there. And that can result in citizen complaints, and we can make them manage the stormwater device per the ordinance, but only to the level of the ordinance. So those are some things that we're seeing. Melinda, to your question, should design storm standards be updated to match today's climate conditions, i.e. require management of the 50-year design storm? This board has used that in other developments as a tool in the toolbox. Should it be the norm? Great question. And what would the response be from the development community if we did? And then, Mr. Chairman, to your question, who should be responsible for addressing those existing downstream deficiencies? If we got a new subdivision and it's abutting another one, like the upper right hand, and it's going, their water is going to the next one, who bears the burden of those existing deficiencies? And then finally, to reiterate, these stormwater controls, they lessen the impacts, but they don't mimic the original conditions, hydraulics, hydrology of the development site. So they're a best practice, so to speak, but they're not a overall solution. So with that, any questions? Be happy to entertain them.
Is it possible to get a copy of this?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Keith, this is Brenda. I had just a couple of questions going into just how the design criteria were set. And one of the questions you brought up, which we've discussed in some of our meetings, was, do you go beyond what the statutes legally require? And how do you do that? And is it a precedent you want to set across the board? How does the development community respond to that, not knowing a standard is a standard or not? And how do you see that developing? And do you know there's any thing in process in the regulations as far as actually changing the regulations?
Yeah, Brenda, what we're talking about here as far as the 25-year storm and the 50-year storm, that is all locally driven. The way these standards got in place in 2008 is we started benchmarking your Carys, your Charlottes, your Raleigh-Durham areas, and they had already gone the way of this quantity control storm. And we actually contracted with Jewel Engineering at that time, worked with some developers, worked with Jim Armentrout, Ramey in general, to kind of look at some land use, how much land would be used to manage at the 10-year event, the 25-year event. And it was basically a settling point with the development community and the builders and realtors to stop on the 25-year storm. That anything else would be too expensive and too infrequent to deal with. But again, those conversations took place in the 2008 timeframe.
So are they being reconsidered now, or I'm just, I've had some concerns of sometimes it comes up as recommended beyond what is typically required and other times it's not, and just looking for some consistency and when that's recommended and when it's not, and what criteria as planning board members we can use to say this is a good idea or not.
Yeah. The only time that we as staff have recommended it is where you have an outlet pipe that's coming into somebody's backyard and you know it's going to be a sensitive and adversarial situation. That's the time that we would bring it to everybody's attention. And if it's a condition of rezoning, that's when we would mention it. But it is an acute condition where we know we will have adverse effects even with the implementation, the full implementation of the base ordinance. So you've got a pipe that's discharging into John Doe's backyard, and it's not if, it's when you will have impacts. So that's when staff has recommended it.
Brenda, I'll add a little bit to Keith's comments there, because I think I know kind of what you're maybe getting at there. Technically, the planning board does have the ability to add a condition to the rezoning dealing with stormwater if the stormwater staff has specifically put it in there and asked for it. There's a menu of things that the planning board can add with respect to conditions in there, and stormwater is one of those. And that's the only time that the planning staff brings that additional condition forward, is when stormwater staff recommends it. You know, it kind of goes back to, and I think the flavor of the discussion goes a little bit back to other regulatory things we've looked at more in the planning world, whether it be sign conditions or sidewalks or some of those things that back in the, the mid 2000s, we didn't have those codified as the ordinance standard. So when somebody came through for rezoning, you might get asked for it and you might not. And so the discussion, was kind of like, man, this is unpredictable. We don't like this. If that's what you want, make it the rule. And we did. So we've got signage rules and we've got, sidewalk rules now. And as I hear this discussion continue to play out at planning board and council meetings, it's starting to take on a lot of those similar characteristics. Whereas, if the expectation for the developer is going to be, the 50-year storm, I guess the discussion really for Keith and the stormwater staff, and maybe it comes from city council or wherever, but is that the new standard? Is that what we need to manage to, is the 50-year storm or whatever those new metrics are? But it's really that predictability for anybody developing land to kind of know what the target is.
Yeah, Aaron, you're hitting right on my concern is, I guess from my regulatory years, you don't want to regulate inconsistency by policy or interpretation. It's important for all the players to understand what the rules are, how they're derived, what their role and authority is in applying them or changing them, and consistency of when you would deviate from the existing standard. So that's what's behind my questions on this is, and you answered somewhat my question, Aaron, do we as planning board members legally have the authority to require something that is not in the rules?
So you do, and remember the developer has to agree to it. So there's that two parts of it. So you can require it, and ultimately the developer has to agree to it. And fortunately, we've been lucky with the ones we've had where the developer has agreed. I guess for the board, one of the things, and I think I shared this with Keith earlier, is, if you're seeing these things and that's given you as a board some pause there, I certainly think the board could ask, city council to take another look at stormwater standards and say, hey, is it time to relook at these again? Is there a new standard? Because we've got concerns about sort of the predictability and sort of the way the process plays out. Now, Keith will tell you, the stormwater ordinance was a bear back in the day, and there was a lot of public involvement and interest around that. And so I know Keith's like, Aaron, don't say that. I don't want to sort of tug at that thread, and I get that. But I do throw that out. At some point, I think we all know that ordinance is going to have to get revisited for all the factors that Keith mentioned. Just the changing data, the climate trends, the challengement of development that we're facing. So, I just throw that out there to the board. That is really your role. So you've got individual roles on a case-by-case basis. And then as a board, collectively, if you think those rules or the process has some issues with it, then that is something for you to think about as well.
Okay, I got
I
one
also
comment.
think,
This, go
sorry,
ahead.
Brenda.
No, go ahead.
But I think we need to make those recommendations very carefully, right? Like, when we make that to developers, like, thinking of the cost implications of building these, they're high. And we unfortunately also live in a place where water meters are expensive. All of these goods that we inject into the economy through development have a cost, right? And it's not always, we have to be very careful on where we're pushing so much so that the project goes away. And so that's the risk, right? And kind of deciding what trade-offs we are comfortable making. And I think that that's really important. We can't just, because this seems like it's happening more often, put that on everyone, because it will actually deter development.
Agreed. This particular facet of the ordinance went back and forth for months between the development community, the regulators, staff, and this went to council for a year and a half before it was solidified. And again, to Mo's point, it's all probability based. The water could cut off tomorrow, could continue for the next 2 years.
Keith, the other factor that you're looking at with this is that you've got a changing topography or landscape because of development, which we're trying to encourage. How often is that reassessed so you know what kind of impact you're going to have on permeation or water quality, water flow quantities? Can you keep up with what's happening quick enough?
George, make sure I understand your question with regard to the topography on a site.
Well, you've got, I mean, we recently had a case on Bethabara Road or whatever. Things have changed. There's been a lot of development over the last 10 years.
Yes, sir.
Through that area. So how often is the flooding and the floodplains of the streams, how often is that regauged so that it keeps up with the types of things that are going on with development?
Yeah, so your riverine floodplain areas are remapped. They're supposed to be remapped every 4 years, but they are in the rears. We don't even know when we're going to get new floodplain maps, but we have flooding in urbanized areas, and with the topography, it's just so challenging. I hate to point out one development, but Briarcliff Village is one site that is incredibly challenged. It is something that is right off Renolda Road, but it is right into the town and country development that is older, antiquated drainage. It has the Lock and Wicklow lakes, and any effects from that development that you see are quickly realized. And it's just because of the situation, the quick time of concentration from that site, its topography, and the clay soils there that are going on with it. So it doesn't have to be a riverine floodplain. It could just be an upland area on Renolda Road that's dropping into town and country.
So how long has it been since the last reevaluation?
Last set of maps, the maps I'm sitting on right now are in upwards of 6 years old as far as FEMA floodplain riverine maps.
Oh boy, okay.
Keith, I have seen that some communities, and quite a few in North Carolina, have citizens advisory committees on stormwater that look at policies and planning and some of these larger issues that we've been talking about today. Is that something that you think we might benefit from here?
Melinda, we have a stormwater appeals board. Would an advisory group benefit? I think it could. The City Council Public Works Committee has kind of self-adopted that role.
Right.
So as staff, I would defer to them on what their pleasure is, and I'll leave that one be.
Yeah, I was just thinking it would take a lot of workload off of that committee, the Public Works Committee, to have another body looking at some of these issues.
Understood. Yep.
You know, I'll hop in for a second to say there've been some great questions asked about this afternoon, and not unusually so. I'm going to come from a completely different direction with a completely different question, and that is to ask on behalf of smaller infill development rather than all new large scale construction and development. Do we really think that that if anything over 1 acre is developed is rational? I would suggest that that may prohibit some of the things we have recently tried to encourage, like cottage courts.
Yeah, and Jack, you're talking about the threshold being the 1 acre or larger common plan of development.
Yeah.
And
when
that's
we
tough.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you could have a Dollar General that's 65% impervious, draining the John Doe's backyard, and it in a certain storm event, it just ravages John Doe's backyard. Then again, you could have the same type of development, more diffuse. It goes through a 1/4 mile of wetlands and whatnot, and you not see any effects from it. So it's all site and topography driven.
Sure. You got a tough job, Keith.
Again, no silver bullet that I've seen on it. We benchmark other communities. Matter of fact, we have discussions with the Charlottes, the Durhams, the Careys, the Chapel Hills all the time. What are you doing? There's a couple of things that folks are trying to do, the low impact development, the green development and stuff like that. They're lowering their road widths and their cul-de-sac widths, trying to reduce the impervious footprint. But it all goes back to maintenance of those devices. If the community and or the owner can't maintain them, then they will fall in disrepair. It's difficult, yes. Good to see you, Jack.
Likewise, thank you.
Well, Keith, before I jump in, any other questions for Keith? I don't see any. First, I want to thank Keith for spending some time with us this afternoon. I know this has been beneficial to the board, and so I want to thank Keith for coming here. And we will certainly be dealing with these issues moving forward for a lot of the reasons that Keith kind of mentioned there. And I know Keith would tell you this: each community's kind of got its own set of challenges. You know, if you're in the western part of the state, the trick is how do you slow the water down fast enough? If you're in the eastern part of the state, it's how do you get it out of here? And you know, we've got our own set of challenges here. All the things that Keith noted here in you know, the Piedmont. So it is a different set of problems no matter where you go, but everybody's dealing with the same stuff right now, and we're going to continue dealing with it. So, but I will say this: Keith and his staff are as knowledgeable and hardworking. They understand this stuff backwards and forwards. They're as good as it gets on this stuff. So we've got a really talented crew here in Winston-Salem.
Have you got time for one more? I'm not sure if it's for Keith or not, but the stormwater fees, Keith, do you all manage those or use those, or?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Are those fees used to run your department, or are they used to repair some of these legacy problems that we have?
So let me give you a couple minute version of that. Yeah, we use the stormwater fees. We take about $10.2 million in every year, and we use it to do the programs for those NPDES water quality things, industry inspections, water quality monitoring, things like that, sampling, whatnot, and inspection of these stormwater controls that we've been talking about. We also do capital projects with them within the public right-of-way, but in large part, any developer-owned stormwater control measure is privately owned. when they submit nowadays a stormwater O&M plan, they have to submit a dollar figure for a capital failure, basically an earmark for capital failure. So our stormwater fees do not do anything to upkeep those privately owned stormwater devices. It's only our right-of-way, city-maintained devices in our purview. But if the developer, the privately owned stormwater control, has a failure, they can request a loan from that catastrophic failure fund to repair their stormwater device, which is kind of a maintenance and perpetuity type program that we've implemented. But the stormwater fees, aside from review, management, inspection, we do not use the stormwater fees for upkeep and maintenance of them, if that answers your question.
Do you spend all of the 10 million in stormwater fees each year, or is a reserve being built? Is that what you're describing?
We have some money in the kitty. Nothing like Courtney talked about. You're going from the sewers that have money to the gutters that have nothing.
Right.
So we have of that 10.2, we subsidize the general fund. We use it pretty much all, but there is a reserve that we are required to achieve so we can issue debt, issue revenue bonds and stuff like that for capital projects.
So the bulk of the stormwater fees go to the general fund?
We subsidize general funds. So seasonal leaf collection, that's subsidized out of your stormwater utility. Vector control, street sweeping, activities like that are paid for out of the stormwater utility.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Keith. Much appreciated. Thanks for spending some time with us this afternoon.
No problem. No problem.
All right, Mr. Chairman, we got one more item on your agenda here, and this is item number 3, and this is UDO CC 14. It's a text amendment that deals with the sign ordinance. Steve Smotherman is going to give a little presentation here. So this kind of deals with 3 facets of the sign ordinance. One is the amortization period that was set to expire next July. The other piece is our electronic message board change rates. And then the third piece are standards for brightness associated with electronic message boards. So we, as Steve's going to tell you here, we went to General Government Committee with this, and Council directed staff to bring back revised standards in all 3 of these areas. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron, and I'll try to be short and sweet with this. As he said, we proposed this text amendment at the recommendation of the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee to what he said, modify the change rate, add brightness limits, and extend the amortization period. This third one is totally separate from the first 2. Extend the amortization period to bring non-conforming on-premises freestanding signs into compliance by 2 years, June 30, 2024. So I'll get into that a little bit further. Next slide, please. The business owners have expressed concerns that the rate of change provisions are too restrictive for electronic message board signs, and that the financial challenges related to replacing non-conforming freestanding signs, particularly due to the recent impact on a lot of businesses of the coronavirus. And there have also been complaints received from citizens about the brightness of some electronic message board signs at night when viewed from the street. I think majority of those have come from churches that have electronic message boards. Next slide, please. So the maximum change rate for these electronic message boards is being increased from changing once every 2 hours to once every minute. And again, that was recommended by the council committee. A very tiny part of the reason is that it will be less time consuming to enforce. If someone currently gets a complaint about 2-hour change rate that they're not following it, you know, if somebody gets there just after the sign has changed and it is an hour, hour and a half time wait between the sign, they could be there for a couple of hours before they actually see it change, but then they've got to wait for another round to see exactly how long the change rate is. So changing it from 2 hours to 1 minute will make that a lot less time consuming to enforce if there are complaints. Next slide. As far as brightness regulations, the maximum brightness level shall not exceed 5,000 nits during daylight hours and 500 nits at night. And a nit is equal to 1 candela per square meter. I looked up the definition of candela. Our current ordinance has that it's a measure of luminous intensity. And I understand why, because the actual definition, I think you have to be a theoretical physicist to understand it. So, but basically it's an international measure, and there are devices that can measure that. All the electronic message board signs shall have a light sensing device that will adjust the brightness as ambient light conditions change. And the sign contractor shall certify in writing that the installed sign meets all brightness regulations prior to final inspection, which means that the sign will not exceed 5,000 nits during the day or 500 nits at night. And these brightness levels are similar to existing regulations that exist in Charlotte, Asheville, and High Point. Next slide, please. As far as the amortization of non-conforming on premises freestanding signs, such signs that were made non-conforming by the provisions of the 2007 Comprehensive Sign Ordinance that Kirk did. The council committee has recommended that they have 2 additional years to come into compliance. They were scheduled to have to be in compliance by June 30th of next year, but the proposals they will now have to June 30th of 2024. And again, as I mentioned, the council committee recommended that to accommodate financial hardships by business owners, particularly small business owners that have encountered during the pandemic. Next slide. I think that's it. And staff is recommending approval of this ordinance amendment. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Steve, what's your definition of night?
It's in the ordinance. It is defined by, I'll have to look up the wording, National Observatory. There are tables, and we have that referenced in the ordinance of when sunrise and sunset is.
Okay, so it's clear in that.
So it would be according to that table.
Yeah. Now, I don't know how many people on the board have been around for 14 years with this, but I was certainly involved in advocating. Clarence, you're one of them. Yeah, and Aaron was around.
Brenda.
Who else was? Aaron, was Chris around? Melinda was. But I was very involved with the city council with this ordinance. There were 2 issues with the changing of the signs, and that it disturbs me that we're reneging on that after 14 years of promising the community one thing. But that's the city council more than us, I think. One of them is that, you know, we keep approving these signs in institutions that are in neighborhoods. So some of these signs are close to residences. And the more these signs change, and with the modern technology, they're changing colors, they're changing the amount of print or pictures that are on it. There are a variety of things that are changing. The more that this changes, the more distracting or just irritating it is to residences that are in the area. The major thing though about the 1 minute was distraction of drivers. And at the 1 minute, we're still at a point where somebody driving 60 miles an hour is going to see these things changes. And you can't just think one sign. That's the thing that's important. And I think I showed the city council back in 06, 07, whatever it was, Stratford Road, where you have 20 signs that you're seeing at one time, and you have 20 signs that are changing in 1 minute, according to what you're proposing here. that is a lot of distraction. So I just would like the staff to go back and simplify it. I can live with less than 2 hours, but let's think of drivers, let's think of residents when we're talking about this, because this is tremendous amount of distraction. We're not talking one sign here.
Yeah, so I'll just mention a couple of things on that. You know, as Steve alluded to a little bit, when we started doing our benchmarking data, Steve, when we were kind of looking at that change rate from other communities, that 1 minute was kind of in the range of what our other peer communities were looking at. Is that a pretty fair statement?
It's more in the middle, but the peer communities actually have a broad range. They go as fast as 8 seconds. And some of them can go, one of them actually goes longer than 2 hours. So it really varies.
Yeah. And so Amy is, I think, pulling some of that up there for us. And we can send you this chart. The other thing, and Kirk may want to speak to this, is I remember a lot of that discussion back around the 2007 timeframe as we were debating this. And I remember, you know, staff kind of did the same thing back in 2007. We sort of did some benchmarking against peer communities. We made a recommendation. We had a lot of debate with the planning board at that time. Clarence and Brenda were both members. They remember that well. And Kirk, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we were coming out of the gate back then with about a 30-second change rate. Is that correct?
That is, Aaron. And in fact, I did a little research on this just in anticipation that this might come up, that the board would be interested in some historical knowledge. And honestly, I forgot just how kind of back and forth some of this stuff went 15 years ago. But originally, the staff came out of the gate in early 06, early 07, late 06 with one change per 30 seconds. The board and the staff kind of came to a consensus in March of 07 that 1 per 8 was reasonable. And that's what this board initially proffered to City Council. City Council took that and kind of initially adopted an ordinance that kept that one change per 8 seconds for entertainment type facilities, such as the Coliseum, which the city owned. And then they kind of imposed a one change per 2 minutes on most other businesses. That led to a lawsuit being filed by a business owner against the city. And the city asked the planning board to come look at some other alternatives. The planning board again kind of showed their support for every 8 seconds being the minimum change interval required. And then council ultimately ended up later in 07 after some significant deliberation with what you have today, which is 8 seconds for older existing signs, and then one change per 2 hours for what's on the ground. But this board as an entity has never really been on record supporting anything more prohibitive than one change every 8 seconds.
Yeah, just adding to that perspective, I think the concern I have is that when all these negotiations and discussions took place, and there was a lot of back and forth, eventually there was a kind of an agreement, I think, in the community to accept, you know, a compromise that not everyone was happy with. And then part of that compromise was a 15-year amortization. And so for 15 years, there's been an anticipation by the people who were part of that compromise that this finally would come to be at some point. And it makes sense, I think, because of the pandemic to extend that amortization, but to go back and revisit the rule before it's actually been implemented, to me, I think is kind of a betrayal to some extent of the trust of the public. That, and I think it can be kind of chilling to the point where people don't trust government to to, keep its promises, so that bothers me. But I'm not so bothered by downgrading the 2 hours to something much less than that. But like Mr. Bryan was talking about, I do have some concern about the 1 minute being on the low end. And 2 minutes, I would find acceptable. I mean, because that was something that was at one point considered in this process. So I see that as a good number. But I do have concern about the 1 minute.
How many signs are in non-compliance? Like, what's
Desmond,
the totality? Are we talking about like 5? And can we come up with some sort of compromise?
I'm sorry, Mo. Desmond, I don't know if you're on there, but I know we sent a report to council, and I can't remember that number. Something makes me want to say like around 700-ish, but I may be totally off, and I would defer to Desmond or Chris if they're still on the call.
It looks like, based on the report that we sent to the council in February, 733 signs remain not compliant. That's about 26% of all freestanding signs in our jurisdiction.
And so, Mo, I want to make sure for the record that is not just electronic message boards. That is signs that are out of compliance that are either too tall or too large. So that's really what's making up that number.
Yeah, and I was
just
going to say,
to like separate that. Like if the signs that are like too big, like let's separate almost the two issues, because I think that they could be kind of in two buckets of if the sign is just too big versus the brightness, right? There's a public safety more concern with the electronic component versus the sizing or shape component. Is there a way to decouple it?
The number of signs that we would have that have I guess that are kind of pre-existing 8-second electronic message board signs, and Desmond and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, that is a very, very small portion of that 730-ish number. I mean, I would venture a guess, just off the top of my head, that's got to be probably less than 50. I mean, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a spreadsheet from early on somewhere that has that information, but I can't recall off the top of my head. Of course, those signs are, besides the one scrolling sign that was on an insurance agency building across from Target, all of those other signs are real easily fixed. So, it's not necessarily that they're hard to fix. It's just they've been able to enjoy something that folks who've gotten those new electronic message board signs over the last 15 years haven't been able to enjoy. But yeah, it's certainly, I want to say, for some reason, I want to say at the time that the ordinance was adopted, I want to say we probably had less than 30 or 35 signs in place that were electronic message board signs. And a lot of
that's
those
my recollection as well. Is again, I don't have it in front of me, but I was thinking about 25 is some research you and I did back in 07 or so when this thing concluded.
Steve, can I ask you another question?
Sure.
And this goes to something that's in the existing ordinance, and I just wanted clarification because George was talking about signs where the colors change, and there's a provision in there that says changes shall be complete and shall not contain any scrolling, flashing, or similar transitional effects between static messages. And I'm just wondering if that language would rule out colors changing where the message stays the same, because that is a capacity that some of these signs have.
That I'm going to defer to Chris or Desmond.
Let me chime in with the intent when we wrote that ordinance, Steve. And Melinda, to your point, we intended this to almost function more like PowerPoint slides, to where it would be a still image, and then that still image would be completely replaced by another still image. So there wouldn't be any fade ins or wipes or flickering. And I think that you could make the case that a color, kind of fading from darker to lighter colors on a slide would not be in keeping with that. So that's, if folks are doing that, now, and then their signs were installed after the ordinance, that sounds like that wouldn't comply with the ordinance as it currently exists.
I agree.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that that was covered, because I think that's also distracting as much as a message change, because changes are what draw your eye to that sign.
This is Brenda. Do we have a lot of complaints about non-compliance on these electronic signs? Does anybody know?
You know, the complaints we get about electronic message board signs changing faster than 2 hours, generally speaking, come from other electronic message board sign owners who are abiding by the rules. That's generally where those things come from. I'm not saying other regular citizens or folks in the community don't call them in, but by and large part, it's somebody calls and says, hey, I'm playing by the rules. They're not. They need to slow their sign down. That's generally where those come from.
Thank you.
I have a question, might be a little stupid, but over the, what is this, 14, 15 years of this, have there been any signs that have been put up that were not abiding by the, I'm gonna say the 2022 expected design requirements, where people still putting them up under the old ordinance? Just wondering.
Walter, they wouldn't have been able to, because again, all new signs going forward from that 2007 date would have had to comply with the new ordinance. So it's only those ones that were existing prior could have been grandfathered and taken advantage of those older rules.
So 735 are older signs.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Aaron, I have a question. How does the planning board staff feel about the 2-minute change? Is there an issue there?
I could live with 2. You know, 1 to 2, I don't know that that's a huge difference. I suspect it's probably getting at some of the issues that city council may have heard that led to their requesting of this change. But if a change from 1 to 2 is helpful, I think staff could support that.
How does everyone feel about that? Any thoughts?
Well, since I'm the one who brought it up, I'm in favor of it.
Okay.
Well, how much difference is there in a board for people that have been complying with a longer time frame? They went to the effort to comply for all these years thinking that that was the deadline. How does this affect them? Are they going to just be happy now it can change more? Will it change? Would they have put in a different kind of sign with that different time interval?
No, I don't.
Easily adjustable.
I don't think so. I think it's really more going in and just calibrating the change rate. I think that's a pretty standard feature on all those electronic message board signs. And it would basically, they would just be able to go in and readjust from a 1 change for every 2 hours to 1 change per every whatever is the new standard.
I just want to be really cautious. Like, does that 2-year amortization, is that also with this 2-minute component? I would hate to give one more burden to the business community right now, right? When we're starting to see some semblance of normal. Like, we need to give them a little bit more time, I think, to adjust to any big changes is my natural instinct.
If the amortization is
from the public and they're just kind of internal to everyone fighting about their own signs with one another, I would hate for that to be a major cost when they're also paying for hand sanitizers and masks for folks, and we don't know what this new wave is going to happen in the fall.
I'll let Chris jump in. I think he was going to say something, but I would certainly assume, you know, for any of those signs that are out there, the electronic message board ones, for anybody that's got one, I don't know that there's any issue with those folks that are complying with the 2 hour, just dropping down to whatever the new established standard is. I don't see that as being a cost burden. That's kind of like we talked about, just going in and changing the settings on there. Chris, did you have anything else you wanted to throw in on that?
I would agree if the new change of rate goes from 2 hours to 2 minutes for the folks that have put in a sign since whatever the effective date was in 2007. I think, you know, they certainly could change their rate to that 2 minutes. Anyone who was legally non-conforming under the original adoption at the 8 seconds, if the amortization extension was approved, would be able to continue to do the 8 seconds up until the time the amortization came to fruition. So June 30th of 2024, if that's adopted.
Yeah, this doesn't hurt any non-conforming signs. It helps them.
Walter, I wanted to respond a little bit to yours. You talked about were new signs coming in that were different. I've been a part of several conversations that have occurred with new signs. Their businesses have come in and put illegal signs up, which the inspections department has had to do something about. There have been a number of those that have occurred during these 14 years. But once they're informed about it, they seem to be conforming and fine with it.
Okay. So it sounds like what I'm hearing, if I summarize this, we're looking at 2 minutes now. Is that correct?
Staff's comfortable with 2 minutes. Given what we're kind of talking about here, again, a departure from 1 to 2, we're comfortable with 2, and we can bring that back in the revised language that comes to you for consideration on August 12th.
Okay.
So
is that okay with everyone? Does anyone have any major issues? All right, we're good. Perfect.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
I still have an issue with it, Chris, but.
All right. Anyone other than Mr. Bryan? All right.
Mr. Chairman, I think we've got debriefing of your July 8th meeting, which was pretty short. I don't know if there's anything to cover there. All right. I've just got, that takes us to staff report. I've just got a few things to hit there. Larry alluded to it earlier as we were coming on. We were actually the first virtual meeting going into the pandemic, and this will be the very last one. So you guys bookended the virtual meeting period of local government here in Winston-Salem. Your August 12th meeting, as we previously discussed, will be in person. It will be in the Arnold King Room in the Stewart Municipal Building on the 5th floor. As you know, we talked a little bit before, that is going to be a lengthy meeting because your agenda is very long. So as the chair stated at your last meeting, I will echo, once you get your agenda materials, if you have a chance to review those and you have some questions, it will be very helpful to staff, to our guests and folks attending, to please email those to us ahead of time so we can try to get those ironed out and get that information to you to help manage the length of that meeting. As far as COVID policies for that meeting, basically what the city has been adhering to is if you have been vaccinated, you are not required to wear a mask. If you have not been vaccinated, you are recommended to wear a mask. So those will be the policies when we come back and meet in person. Staff has given a little thought to the Arnold King Room, and as you know, the seating area there is a little bit tight for guests. I think what staff will be looking to do is probably cordon off every other seat to make sure that we're giving a little bit of additional separation to our guests who are coming to those meetings. So what that will do naturally is it'll decrease our capacity in that room by half. What we're likely going to do is try to use the IS conference room on the 5th floor as overflow for our guests. And then we'll also have our conference room here on the 3rd floor as additional overflow if needed. So staff is continuing to think through the logistics there. It might lead to some pauses in your meeting, a little brief pause. If we need to get folks for cases in and out, we may need to think about how logistically we do that, but we want to try to offer a little bit of separation to our guests that are coming there, especially in light of the fact that our COVID cases are starting to tick back up a little bit. As you come to that meeting, one of the things that the city has been working on are some enhanced security procedures for this building. So most of you should have a badge that the city was issued. It's a generic badge. I think it says board member. If you have that, please bring that with you. You'll need to show that to the guard, and then you'll be free to jump on the elevator and then come up to the 5th floor meeting room. Mr. Chairman, I talked with Tara. I think you do not have one of those because you were right across the street and you didn't need it for parking purposes. So
Right.
as I understand from Tara, we're tracking one down from you. If any other board members do not have a board member badge, please let me or Tara know as soon as possible so we can get one of those made and get that to you in advance of your August 12th meeting. And you'll need that from now on. So please do not lose that. Please make sure to show that to the guard. Shouldn't have any issues from there. This will be your first meeting all together in well over a year, and we have got some new members to the board and some members that haven't met other members. So what I offer to the chair is we'll provide some additional kind of better appetizers, heavy hors d'oeuvres, those kind of things. For one, if you want to come around 4 o'clock to meet each other and spend a little time together before your meeting at 4:30, and also knowing the meeting could last a little longer, we'll have something above and beyond the traditional snacks you're used to there for that meeting. The only other thing I have, and I think I sent it to you in email form today from the city attorney. I know there were questions about the future of remote meeting participation moving forward. The city attorney's email really spelled that out. The policies that we're operating under right now, being able to do an entire meeting virtually, will come to an end on July 30th with the removal of the governor's order. So beginning August 1st and moving forward, the only thing that's really in place is the remote participation policy that the city council has adopted, and it extends to boards and commissions, whereas you have to have a quorum in place in the meeting room itself. And if there are any members that want to participate remotely, you've got to have a qualifying reason, whether it be illness, caring for a family member, and I think she laid those qualifying events out in her email. So we haven't traditionally done that. That would be a bit of a challenge for the planning board, given the nature of your business moving forward. So I don't know that there is a wide range of ability to continue to meet remotely for the planning board, given the city policies we've got going on. As the chair and I talked this morning, it wouldn't surprise me if there's some discussions at the state level about thinking about how remote meeting policies could look in the future for local governments. I think everybody's had an extensive amount of experience and participation in these, but that is something that would have to come from the state level, and we'll certainly keep an eye on that. But I could see a discussion taking place for that. So I think those are all the items I have for your meeting coming up on August 12th. That's all I've got for staff report, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. This was a great precursor to our August 12th meeting as far as time. So I look forward to seeing everyone. Is there anything else for the good of the order?
I just wanted to let everybody know, I finally had a chance to go up on the strollway, the new paved strollway. And if you get a chance, go stand where it crosses the Salem Parkway now. It's really a good view of the city. And it really gave me an appreciation of all those meetings we sat through and all that work that went into by the whole community and making that happen. Made me really proud of the city and glad to be a part of it. So if you get a chance to do that, I highly recommend that.
Absolutely. And Mr. Chairman, I think I lied to you. I had just one teeny tiny little thing on staff report. If the board would afford me about 60 more seconds here.
Sure.
I'm going to send this to you, but we publish our quarterly development dashboard, and hopefully you guys can see this here. When I say it's been rocking in our office, these numbers I hope will help to demonstrate that. You can see that top chart right there is a 5-year window and sort of our non-residential construction permit values, and you can see what 2021 has looked like, and this is for the second quarter of 2021. So when I say it's been busy here, these numbers kind of back that up. When you scroll down a little bit here and you look at residential construction values, I mean, we're right there. And then, when you look at sort of total construction values, and just this quarter alone, $415 million in permit value. And then when you look at the permits we've issued over this past quarter, it has been rolling here, and these numbers help to validate that. So this will come to you by email. I just want to give you a little preview of that to let you know what you're going to be seeing.
All right.
Good.
Ms. Smith?
Thank you.
All right, we'll have our motion to adjourn.
Second. All right, everyone have a great evening.
All right,
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
See you in August.